in 314 for a shooting at Century Theaters. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. You're cleared hot. An officer hit. Send me the world.
Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again.
Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
Welcome back to Tactical Tangents. This is Mike. This episode is brought to you by Palm Industries. I have maintained for a long time that pepper spray is a way underused tool in law enforcement, and I get it. When you have to arrest someone, you do not want to have to get that stuff on you. But in personal defense or concealed carry scenarios, you want to create standoff and increase the distance, not go hands-on. I can tell you hundreds of stories about confrontations I have been involved with in real life that were resolved with some form of less lethal long before a gun would have been an option. Why not carry some in your pocket? Palm pepper spray is small, easy to carry, and it's effective. If you need something in between harsh words and a gun, this is a $12 solution. It's available on Amazon, makes a great gift. Go check them out at palmpepperspray.com. That's palm, P-O-M, pepperspray.com.
And this is Jim. This episode is also brought to you by ManusX. We've talked a lot about the tactical fantasy on this podcast, and one of the quickest ways to break your tactical fantasies and actually improve your performance is by getting real feedback. One of the ways you can do that is with ManusX. You're not going to get better at shooting on your own. You need practice, data, and coaching. And you need to make the most of your ammo with good live and dry fire training. Manus is a family of training devices that tracks you while you train. It times and tracks everything you do in a drill and coaches you as you go. It is indispensable to taking your shooting to the next level. Go find them on manusx.com. So Mike, kids these days, am I right?
Yeah, these noobs, the rookies, the kids, it's a thing. It's a whole thing.
We should probably help them, help them pull their heads out of their asses a little bit.
Shouldn't everyone?
Get them to check their privilege. You know, you're new here. You need to do the new guy thing.
Like,
you
remember,
need to,
rookie, I have more time in the shitter in this place.
That's right.
Than you've probably been alive or whatever.
You need to make the jalapeno popcorn. You need to mop the floors. You need to make sure the shitter's full of porn. Whatever it is you do as the new guy, we need to make sure you're doing your new guy checklist.
Yeah.
The fighter dudes, and I'm not a fighter dude, but the fighter dudes have a saying, there's only a couple things we want to hear from the new guy. We want to hear two, which is how you acknowledge radio calls. Lead, you're on fire, and save the fat girl for me, right? That's it. So that gets us to a discussion about mentoring. How do we help these youngins? So this mentoring, in my mind, it starts with a sense of ownership and responsibility. Oh, serious stuff, but it does. You gotta feel a sense of ownership. You gotta feel like you are responsible for both the organization and the people inside of it. And if you look around and you think to yourself, kids these days, or these jackwagons, they're coming in, they're more interested in their TikToking, their yeets than doing their jobs. Understand those are your jackwagons.
Yeah.
And you have a responsibility to them and to the institution, whatever institution that is, whether that's the East Podunk Police Department or the United States Marine Corps or whatever. You have a responsibility to the institution to help them pull their heads out of their asses. And that is the theme of tonight's episode. We're going to talk about mentoring.
Yeah. And you got to remember that there is a lot that comes with the new generation, right? The new generation can relate to the current generation in many ways better than us old guys can. And we bring a whole lot of institutional knowledge and experience to the table, sure.
And they know how to open PDF files, which I don't, so that's good.
But, right, and so there's a way, like a conduit maybe, that we can convey some of that institutional knowledge to them, and then they can take and apply to their new reality. And that doesn't mean that they're going to become exactly like you. And you have to kind of embrace that. It doesn't mean that you don't have a say or you don't shape them or lead them or influence them in some way. And from an institutional or organizational standpoint, what you have to recognize is this is like the secret sauce that really gets leadership into the culture of your group or your team. Oh, yeah. And it's a really important way of building out the informal leadership within the ranks, right? But the thing about it is you can't force it. You have to foster it. And there's a big lesson in that.
Yeah, that generational thing you mentioned, it's a good point because, you know, I'm a dad and Mike's a dad, and we think a lot about like how to be good dads. And there's some meme floating around recently that talked about like you have to prepare your kids to live in a world that you've never lived in yourself.
Yeah.
Right. You have to prepare them for the future. You know, I've been in the military for 20 years fighting Al Qaeda or whatever remnants of Al Qaeda is still around. And it is entirely possible the next generation is also going to be fighting, you know, the son of Al Qaeda, but they also have to be ready to fight, like, I don't know, China. And I honestly have no idea how we're going to fight China. So there's that. So, you know, I like that generational point, but you mentioned, Mike, the you can't force it, you got to foster it. And that's a huge point for us is you can't assign mentoring. You can't schedule mentoring. You can't encourage it. And that's kind of as far as you can go. Like you can remind the crusty old dudes to find a young guy or gal and teach them some stuff. And there's also, I think, a misconception that mentors have to be older or higher ranking, or much older, much higher ranking. Some of the best mentorship is like bro level or sister level, whatever, right?
Yeah.
Hearing
Within
from
reach is a big thing.
Yeah. People you can relate to. Specifically, it's people you can relate to, right? So like hearing from the last guys who just went through pilot training or the last SWAT school, and especially in the military, some of the most important mentoring isn't from like the big commanders. It's from the NCOs up to the junior officers, right? And I don't work in medicine, but I imagine that's kind of similar in terms of like nurses and techs mentoring the new doctors. In fact, that is your window of opportunity to help them pull their heads out before they are the big bosses. So speaking of forcing it, the Air Force, doing the most Air Force thing I can imagine, published a handbook, an Air Force instruction manual
Of course they
about
did.
mentoring. So I cracked it open because that's who I am. So Air Force Handbook 36-2643 dated 17 May 2019. It defines mentoring differently in two different places, it turns out. But paragraph 2.1 says mentorship is a type of professional relationship in which a person with greater experience and wisdom guides another person to develop both personally and professionally. This relationship helps achieve mission success and motivates airmen to achieve their goals. Yes, true. It goes on. Paragraph 2.2. Mentoring promotes a climate of inclusion that can help foster and develop the diverse strengths, perspectives, and capabilities of all airmen. The Air Force capabilities and warfighting competencies are enhanced by diversity among its personnel. Reference Air Force Policy Directive 36 TAC 70, Diversity and Inclusion.
This is definitely not politicized at all.
I found that handbook very helpful. I'm filled with mentorship
Are you
love.
so mentored right now?
Yeah, but so a couple years ago, the Air Force tried to officialize this, is where I'm going with that. And there was a portal. You were supposed to type in your information in the portal, and it was supposed to like eHarmony match you to like a mentor, and you were supposed to sit down and do some sessions. And then took about 3 seconds for the entire Air Force to be like, this is the dumbest thing we've ever dealt with since the last dumbest thing we ever dealt with. And so now it's kind of like a do it yourself, which is how it always has been and always will be.
And that's kind of the point, is that mentoring by its nature is sort of an informal thing. And this is why, like, having someone within reach, someone that is a peer, it's a little bit easier to be vulnerable with that person than with the big boss. And that goes both ways. Like, the big boss is probably not going to be as willing to open up and let in like a very brand new person that hasn't really earned, right, their place. So there's something to be said about being sort of within reach of each other.
Or the mentorship you get from the big boss, and you should get some mentorship from the big boss, is going to be a lot more vague, a lot harder to relate to, and it's going to be stuff that was relevant to that big boss, which is often separated by a pretty big generation, to get that big boss into that big boss position. So it tends to be very, very career-y. And
So Jim, what you're saying is you should diversify the mentors in your life. You should have
it does.
have
It
some
takes
younger
a
guys,
village.
have some older guys. Yeah,
That's right.
Because diversity inclusion, I think I read that in a Air Force policy directive somewhere
I
recently.
just threw up a little bit in my mouth. No, I want to be clear. I'm not anti-diversity and inclusion, just to be clear, before like the MEO people parachute out of the windows to come shoot me. But ironically, maybe it actually does take a little bit of diversity to do this right. It takes a village to raise an operator.
Yeah, because you're going to get different things from different people, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. But I think having guys that are sort of within reach that you can relate to is a big part of it, because vulnerability is a big part of it, and trust is a big part of it. And where this really, I mentioned earlier that this is sort of the secret sauce. It's one of those areas where the informal pressure within an organization sometimes can accomplish a lot more than the formal pressure. And the analogy that I've always used to describe this is like, if my boss has to write me up for something because like, yeah, I technically, like I screwed something up. I broke a rule. I broke a policy. I am way less worried about getting written up than I am like disappointing dad. And you want to work for a boss, like a frontline supervisor, immediate supervisor, that you're a lot more worried about how they think of you than about like the formal stuff that might go in a file somewhere and never get looked at again, right? So within a robust organization with a lot of mentoring, formal leaders in those positions that might have to do the writing up, this is where you have to sort of recognize and foster, like we said earlier, that environment where there are mentors and informal lower level leaders that can intervene and sort of help work some of those things out. And that can be a really hard balance to strike, especially if you can imagine like I'm sure Jim's got examples of this, but in law enforcement, for example, like everything's on camera. If people screw up, there has to be accountability, there has to be transparency, there has to be all of this. But there's also got to be a way, a mechanism that makes it more or less okay or acceptable that like a buddy can take his guy over and be like, dude, like you need to cool it. Like that was a little much, right? And the idea in this is like you can get this sort of intervention before it becomes too serious, right? Before something egregious happens. If it's something that's just sort of on the edge, it's like, do I really need the formal boss to come step in and cut paper on this? Hopefully your organization has this mechanism where the guys are held accountable on a higher level than just the policy, right? And those things sort of work themselves out, right? Behind the scenes, if you will. And to be clear, I'm not saying you should sweep stuff under the rug or anything like that. I'm just saying that the goal is early intervention, to stop little things before they become big things. And that requires sort of everybody to be involved in the process. It's peer accountability, right? And when Jim talks about having a mentor that's more or less within reach, it's got to be at almost that peer level. Like that's a big part of making it robust. And there's an example of this. I don't want to dime anybody out here. I won't name names, obviously, but
their name rhymed with
yeah, no. There was a guy that I talked to who is a younger, newer guy about something related to like his driving. And I was like, dude, this is some of the more dangerous things that we do is drive around in these cars. It's a lot more worrisome to me than getting shot at, if I'm being honest. And so like you might want to just slow down a little bit and keep an eye on it. And it wasn't long after that. He got in a crash or something. And look, I've been in some crashes. I get it. It like shit happens, right? But it came on the heels of being talked to about it, right? And then it was apparently those warnings were not heeded, as it were. And now there's paperwork, right? And I bet he's thinking now, In fact, he's made some comments about it like, well, I'm pretty sure he doesn't want me driving. And I'm like, hopefully you've learned your lesson there, buddy. But there's some credibility that comes from that, right? Like now he's probably listening. The next time I've got to pull him aside for something, he might be like, maybe I should hear him out a little bit, right? So that was one story of how you can learn something the hard way. And if only someone were there to sort of catch you before you slip up and fall too hard, if only. So there was another scenario where I gave someone some advice on something related to, I think it was like a DUI investigation that turned into like an aggravated assault on a police officer. I don't remember. This is all kind of fuzzy. But where you try to talk to a guy and they just like blow you off, right? And they're just like, yeah, fuck off. And part of that like culture within the organization being robust is being able to say like, all right, you don't want to hear what I have to say? Like, your boss is going to hear about it, you know, and talking to the supervisor and be like, hey man, I tried to pull this dude aside and tell him what's up. But you know, here in this department, we are accountable to each other and we hold our peers to a high standard. And if he's not going to listen to me, then we're going to make sure it gets addressed another way, and making sure that that message is heard clearly. Right. And hopefully what that taught him in the aftermath when the supervisor went and dealt with it was you need to be coachable. Like, because there are people who are going to try to coach you that will keep you out of trouble. Because now it becomes my problem, and that's going to be your problem, right?
And this is a really important point, is that if someone is going to take the time to try to call you out, think about all the things that have to be true. Like, they're putting themselves at risk to say something to you. If they're going to take the time and the effort to say something to you, shut the hell up and listen. They're probably doing it for a reason, right?
Yeah. And sometimes the reason is their own ego, right? It can be self-serving. It can be that they
That's fine.
are trying to pump themselves up or whatever. But in a lot of cases, there might be threads of truth in there that are still worth hearing out. And there's nothing wrong with being coachable and receptive and being able to be like, okay, I'm going to discard these parts, but I'm going to keep these parts. Right. And so there's a famous quote, Viktor Frankl, he was a Holocaust survivor, and he says, between every stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space, there is a choice. And I'm paraphrasing, the quote's a little bit longer than that, but the idea is that when someone comes to you and they say something, there's a pause in which you respond to that somehow. And in that pause, right, in that space, there is a choice where you could say, how do I want to respond to this? Do I want to be a dick? Like, do I want to be the cocky, arrogant young guy? Or do I want to be like, hey man, I appreciate the input. Yeah, I'll keep a better eye on it. And then I can go on about my day and I can ignore him if he's a douchebag, or I can go run it by somebody else that I actually trust. And that kind of gets into one of the key things about a mentorship that Jim talks about when it comes to trying to force this, like with a pamphlet or something or a policy. It doesn't work like that. Mentoring is an at-will relationship. Right? Mentoring is something that is built on credibility, right? And when a person is choosing their mentors, and what that really means is deciding who they're going to listen to, who is credible to them, right? There is also a process in which a mentor will say, hey, this is a guy I want to help. This is a guy I want to coach, right? There's this little selection phase that happens where one guy has to be coachable and one guy has to be credible. And there is some chemistry that happens there that makes it work. And you can't force that. It has to happen sort of organically, if you want to use that word.
So we've kind of established that one thing we really understand about this is the force is a problem, right? And the more you try to force it, the less it really happens. There are some things you can do to encourage it, though. You can literally kind of mix people around, mix them together. I mentioned an example where the Air Force tried this and screwed it up. Ironically, one of the big successes is the Air Force figured out we need a bar in flying squadrons. Basically, every flying squadron in the entire, probably the military, but definitely the Air Force, has a bar.
Where can I get those at my police station? Can I get a kegerator?
Every desk drawer in every movie I've ever seen about the cops. Right. So institutionally, the Air Force tried to destroy that. Right. They tried to deglamorize alcohol and said you can't have a bar. So flying squadrons created a heritage room where we celebrate our heritage. But I understand the Air Force was trying to deglamorize alcohol, and, unless you're an airline pilot, drinking and flying isn't supposed to mix. Okay, I got it. But we found that some of the most important mentoring happens around the bar on Friday afternoons, right? Once flying's done, everyone goes to the bar and kind of shoots the shit with each other. And in fact, the fighter squadrons do this whole frat ritual around it. And in that ritual, the roll call experience, guys get nicknames for stupid stuff they did. So you got a guy named Ike because he's know-it-all. So he's I know everything. And you got this other new guy. He's I know everything also. So he'll be IKEA. And this guy was eating a tuna sandwich. So we call him Tuna. And that's how kind of the bonding happens, right? And guys are expected to do a confessional in front of the bros where they fess up about their mistakes. Hey, I screwed this up. I went in afterburner when I wasn't supposed to, or I punched flares when I wasn't supposed to. And they take their shot and they go on with their day, right? So it's kind of a confessional experience. Or they share lessons they learned the hard way. And guys call each other out. And this is important. They call each other out up and down the pay scale. So when the number 2 guy in the squadron, instructor pilot, screws something up and he doesn't fess up about it, the whole rest of the team says, hey, you remember that time when you punched flares and you weren't supposed to? Yeah, we do.
We will never let you forget.
Here's your shot, sir. Right. So, and that's a good thing. And that is part of that mixing experience where people learn each other and they kind of learn each other's cues and learn from each other. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. And this is kind of that environment, that's pure accountability in a sense, right? Because you've created this thing where hey, we're going to call you on your shit. No matter what, it's going to come out one way or the other. And so you can either be accountable to that and work to improve and grow, or you could be the guy that gets butt hurt and becomes kind of the thorn in everyone's side. And that's a key thing in this too, is that in mentoring, different than formal leadership type of settings, there's no obligation to listen, right? Guys might give advice, they might give input, they might make fun of you. There's all kinds of things that might occur in that little process, but what you do with that is up to you. And this comes up in parenting all the time when I tell my kid, hey buddy, don't play with that, you're going to fall. And then I'm just like, okay, I'm going to just go get my medic bag right now because here it comes.
It hurt when you did that, didn't it?
Yeah. I told you should have listened to me. And I could, you could be the formal leader that stops and intervenes and doesn't allow the bad outcome. Or you can say I'm going to if he falls, then that'll be a lesson learned. And that's a good example of how leaders in organizations have to decide when they should intervene and when they should let the system work it out in a more natural way with informal leadership, right? There are certainly times where I'm not going to let my kid find out the hard way that running across the street might get him hit by a car. I'm going to stop that. But if he might fall off the edge of the couch, well, yeah, he'll be all right. It's a lesson learned, right?
I like that. And buried in all of this is leadership, right? Leadership, the art of influencing and directing people in a way which wins their obedience, confidence, respect, and cooperation. And they will watch your example. That will happen. So a lot of organizational leadership happens in this mentoring environment, right? The informal stuff. This is where you set social norms. This is where you set culture. And culture kicks procedures ass and takes its lunch money every day of the week.
Yep.
And this is where kind of you can encourage the older cadre in whatever organization you're in to help you as a leader set that culture. Okay. these sessions, whatever sessions, whatever form they end up taking, this is where you give insight informally into how you think as a leader, what rules you care about, what rules you're willing to bend, what your intent is. All of that ultimately gets you implicit guidance and control, which we learned from this dude named Boyd is a big deal because it speeds up how people make decisions, right? The guys are going to listen to you, but more importantly, they're going to watch you and how you interact with people and how you handle getting called out and how you handle frustration. They're going to see that and they're going to mimic it.
And the young guys will see how the organization handles those things. And that like that's the key part of it is you're indoctrinating someone into the culture of the organization. So it's not just about if you're that guy, people are going to notice if you don't take it well, but also the new guys are going to recognize that like, oh, this is how it goes around here. Even that guy got called out.
Yep.
So speaking of the things that they are going to see, the new guys are going to see about how the room, if you want to call it that, handles stuff like this whole dynamic, right? Is they're going to start to figure out like the guys worth listening to and the guys that are kind of more or less blown off. And this is a key part of mentorship is that credibility is the key, right? And finding a good mentor, the foundation of that is someone who is credible and that there is trust with.
Humble, approachable, credible. I stole that from one of the Air Force schools, but it's true. Like you need to be those things. And with the credibility thing is just understanding, like, don't bullshit them. Like you're just kind of wasting everyone's time at that point. They're going to detect it. Presumably they're not stupid. And also you're not helping anybody. So this is your opportunity to kind of level with them and be honest about what you see. That doesn't mean you need to be inappropriate necessarily, although I am. But you can be honest about kind of where things are and where they're going and whoever the mentee is, how they're doing. Hey, you're doing great. Hey, you're not doing great. And these are the things people are saying. Right? Be kind of a feedback mechanism.
And there's also part of this like lead by example. Part of it is you're going to mentor people throughout your career that are younger or newer than you perhaps. And you're going to learn a lot along the way as well. So like one of the examples that you want to set is if you give someone bad advice or bad feedback or you get something wrong, own it. And show them what that should look like, right? Like set that example. So speaking of mentoring people throughout your entire career and getting mentored along the way, one key lesson in this is that everyone needs mentors. Everyone is going to be mentored along the way throughout. And don't ever be naive enough to think that like you're the one who has everything figured out. Even if you don't realize it, someone is probably trying to coach or nudge you. And it should stand out. If you're surrounded by people in your like professional life that you haven't deciphered who to listen to and who not to, you should probably explore that is what I would offer. And this process never stops. It doesn't matter at what level you are. The president of the United States has advisors, right? Like there's people at every level that will always have people worth listening to. Even if the decision falls in that person's hands, they still have trusted people that they go to for input on things.
And if you don't have it, you need to go find it, right? Yeah. You need to make a point of surrounding yourself with smart people who are willing to call you out on your bullshit.
Yeah. Because it never stops, right? There's always growth to be had. And at every level, any situation you find yourself in, someone else that you know has probably been there, or at least in something close enough that it might give you some sounding board to figure out what things to do next, right? Or what things to take into consideration. And the idea is that one of the things that the benefits of informal leadership in this sense is they give advice, right? They don't tell you what to do. They don't give orders. They don't insist. They don't demand. They don't require. They give you advice. They give you ideas. And just because that you have an advisor or a mentor doesn't mean that you don't have your own autonomy to make decisions. And that's part of your development, is being able to take that advice and apply it in whatever context that you're dealing with, right? So how do we get there? How do we get to having good mentors or being a good mentor? What are the steps? Because we can't force it. We talked about that. We can't really put it in a pamphlet or a directive necessarily. And that's kind of one of the big lessons to me. And I'm sure Jim has some thoughts, but one is like, don't try too hard. I kind of look at this. There's something like relationships in all of this, that there has to be some chemistry there, right? Like you need to be compatible with the person and there needs to be some chemistry. And I've learned those are not the same things, right? You have to be grounded in the same set of values and there has to be some sort of connection. It's kind of like leading a horse to water, right? That whole analogy about like you can lead a horse to water, but you can't force him to drink. It requires a little bit of that mentality. You can't force it. Everyone has their own strengths and weaknesses. We're all going to complement each other in different ways. This like mentor-mentee relationship has to find the ways that we complement each other to build that relationship and build that dynamic.
In fact, one of my mentors in pilot training said, Jim, I can lead a horse to water, but I'm not going to suck on its ass to make it drink. And
well put. Yeah.
That was a good little mentoring session, now wasn't it? Right. Understand that mentoring can take a lot of forms, and the more you try to fit it into a box, the it's not going to go as well, right? You can have a formal mentoring session, and you probably ought to. If you're a boss, sit down with every individual person who works for you and have a session with them. Talk about what they're trying to achieve, how they're going to get there, give them some insights into how you got where you got. A lot of the times in a military context, mentoring comes down to like career advice. Okay, these are the assignments that you need in order to, get your next promotion. You should be ready to move at this year in order to make your paperwork look right, like that kind of thing. And that's good and it's important, and people need to know how to set themselves up for career success. But it doesn't stop there. That is one type of session. Okay. It's usually like that. It's often like that, but it doesn't have to be. It can be just the little quick elevator pitch that you give to every new guy in the unit. Hey, I'm Bob. I'm new here. Cool, Bob. Let me give you 2 or 3 things that I think are important for you. This and this and this, right? That little elevator pitch that you give to him might help start that relationship. You become a trusted advisor through that, right? It can be a tip you pass along to a cluster of new guys. You see 3 new guys sitting around the water cooler. You say, hey, new guys, let's talk about this thing, right? A little hip pocket training, education, a tip, a suggestion, a trend that you've been noticing. Get that information out there. It can also be a quick passing critique. And this is a thing I wish we did more and that we did better. If someone's screwing up, maybe you don't need to have like an hour-long counseling session with them. Maybe the best thing you can do is a quick, like, hey, bud, we don't do that here.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, that is a more effective intervention than the bigger, more formal stuff, right? Hey, that's not a thing that we do. Or, hey, you're coming across like more of a dick than I think you mean to. Hold up the mirror so they can see how they're coming across to people. There can be some tough love in there. It doesn't all have to be tough love. It can be a warm, fuzzy mentoring. Hey, buddy, you're doing great. You're doing super good. Here's how we're going to get you to chief or captain or, sergeant major or whatever. Like, it can be that stuff. But there's a spectrum of forms this takes, right?
Yeah. And I think... And I've always struggled at that. Like, I always come across like a dick, and I don't mean to come across like a dick, but I've gotten that advice my entire life, and I have not done a great job of correcting that necessarily. I've worked on it, I think, I hope, maybe I've gotten better. I don't know. It hasn't come up in a while, so maybe that's good. In either case, though, I think a key part in what Jim is saying there is like a quick like leash correction is kind of the analogy that I use for that, where you say something and you're like, listen, motherfucker, that's not how this is going to go. And then that's it. Like, you don't hold a grudge. You don't make it a big deal. No one's cutting paper. There's nothing like that. It's just, it was addressed. It's over with. We move on about our day. And it fosters that environment where like, hey, for one thing, you'll get called on it. But two, like, people make mistakes. No one's going to hold it against you. We can recover from that. Not the end of the world. And part of that, like the other analogy that Jim used in there, the elevator pitch, this is good because like it suggests or implies a salesmanship component. And that's big in this, is that like, remember, the relationship of a mentor is not about being their boss and not being too forceful, right? It's part of building a relationship with that person so that they want to listen to you, right? Or if you are the person being coached, recognizing that, hey, this guy is helping me out, like, I should probably listen because he's doing me a favor in some way, right? So I hate to make it sound like it's all about like a relationship with a person, but I really think that having good mentors, they do kind of need to be sort of an insider buddy. It is kind of a friend that you trust. And I think you have to see it as that and not as necessarily a leadership thing, right? Like, you don't want it to be too structured. It needs to be sort of informal, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And it doesn't, it's not all leash corrections, right? Like, at some point,
positive and negative reinforcement.
At some point, you need some kind of personal relationship. A lot of mentoring, most mentoring, starts with some kind of personal relationship. There has to be that trust friendship thing and a connection somewhere. But understand that can very quickly look like, and surprisingly often become, fraternization and favoritism. And that stuff will tear up a team, especially when you have people on opposite sides of the gender spectrum or opposite sides of the rank spectrum or both. Okay. That appearance shows up quicker when we have men mentoring women and women mentoring men. That is the nature of the world. Sorry if I'm the first person to tell you that. And that's a shitty deal, honestly, because both men and women need mentoring. And sometimes the best way to get through to someone is across those lines, and that's okay, right? The key here, in my mind, is you got to kind of spread the wealth. You don't always sit down with one person, even if you do have a connection with them, right? There are some people who you're just going to click better with. You go to the same church as them, or you're going to the gym at the same time as them. You'll laugh at the same jokes. The chemistry, it is a thing, and it's a good thing. But if you're always taking the same junior trooper to Starbucks for a mentoring session, especially if she's already getting a lot of attention, you are going to get a lot of attention. So consider things like little group meetings. Hey, I'm taking all the newbies. We're going to Starbucks. Let's talk. Or Dunkin' Donuts, or whatever the cops do. So spread the wealth a little bit. Don't just sit down with one person. There are some people you're going to connect with more than others, but make an effort, make an overture toward as many people as you can.
Yeah, I want to hit something that Jim talked about in the beginning of that, where he was talking about the tough love and not everything needs to be a leash correction thing. What we want to be really careful about is not creating an organization where like everyone's just a dick, right?
A new guy. Fuck you.
Yeah, like it's just an impenetrable, like adversarial place to be. Like you're not trying to create an environment of negativity, right? Yeah. Like tough love is one thing, but having a high standard is one thing. I remember when I was brand new on SWAT, like I felt very, very welcomed by the team. The SWAT school selection was hard, right? Like not just the difficulty of the school so much as like the sort of the indoctrination process of that culture. Like there's a lot of criticism. There's a lot of very harsh, like they're looking closely, right, at everything. A lot of
scrutiny, a lot of debrief. Yeah.
But like once you've made it, you're on the team, everyone's friendly, and you have a voice, and everyone has a voice. Like they will open it up to the room. Who's got any ideas? And that's one of the things that like stood out to me as a new guy on SWAT was that the team was very welcoming and open and receptive to that. That doesn't mean that there wasn't those tough love moments, right? Like there was a lot of that, but you didn't feel like you were unwelcomed or that you didn't belong there. And that's a fine line to dance sometimes. And the other thing about like mentor-mentee relationships is they change, and sometimes they have an expiration date. They're going to come and go. You're going to have people that you might outpace in your career. You're going to have people that maybe their attitudes shift and they don't become as helpful or useful. They don't evolve. There's a lot of that goes on, and you have to just recognize that like they're going to come and go. Those relationships come and go just like any other. And there was one time in particular, going back to the tough love and not being a dick thing. There was a younger officer that I helped train. I was one of his field training officers. So that was a more formal setting, right? And then afterwards, like I tried to have a relationship with the people that I trained afterwards, that if you ever need anything, like I'm always here for advice. You got my number. I'm always happy to help out, right? And so he did that routinely. Hey, let me run this by you. What do you think about this? Before I call the boss or whatever, like I just want to see what you think about this scenario. Or I have a Fourth Amendment search and seizure thing, or something. And there was this one time, this dude called me and he gave me this scenario, right? He was like, "Yeah, I did this, I did that, and I just want to know, like, what do you think about this?" And I was like, "Yeah, man, I agree with so and so. I think you fucked up. I think you need to slow down a little bit, see the big picture. Don't get sucked into something like that and find yourself, that could have ended really bad, right?" And I flamed him for it a little bit, in that sense, just that, and I wasn't being a dick about it. That's just how it was. And he made some remark about like, "Well, I bet if you were in the situation, you would have done the same thing." And I'm like, because I guess apparently he got chewed out by some senior officer. And so he was calling me essentially to validate his decision making, right? To like counter.
He didn't want to hear your opinion. He wanted to hear his opinion in your voice.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
He was trying to counter the senior officer's input with my with my validation of whatever he did. And I'm like, "Look, man, like I didn't get where I'm at now by like not being in those situations a time or two and figuring out how they should be handled. Like if you want to call me for advice, I'll give it to you. But if you're calling me because you just think that I'm going to tell you what you want to hear, you're calling the wrong dude. So don't call me if that's what you want. If you want me to keep it real with you, I'll always do that. But I'm not going to sit here and just tell you what you want to hear. You're calling the wrong guy." And there was a period of time that he was kind of like butthurt about that. I texted him, I think the next day or a day later. I'm like, "We good? Like, you want to talk it out?" And he was like, "No, we're good." And the relationship continued. But it was one of those tough love moments where I had to tell him like, "Hey man, like I'm not here to just sing your song, right? Like you called me for advice. I'm giving you my advice. Don't sit here and talk shit about it." Like, so, monitor for those things. And there are interactions like that with people that like, maybe we don't recover from that. Maybe he just stops calling me, right? And he calls some other friend of his that tends to agree with him. And that's up to him, right? Remember, it's an at-will relationship, and we grow and learn along the way. I mentioned that earlier, that there are times that I look back at advice that I've given and I'm like, I could have probably given better advice at times to people. And so you have to be sort of open to that and recognize that too, that even as the mentor, those relationships will evolve over time.
They will evolve. And one of the most important things you mentioned was, recognizing when you're not the right guy for them. And one of the things you can do is you can help them connect and network. And based on their goals and their interests and aptitude and personality, knowing you may not be the best person to help them is important. But you probably know someone who can, someone they're going to connect better with, or that they need to learn some lesson from. And when you're one of the old guys, one of the most important things you can do and bring to this interaction is your contact list, what we used to call back in the day your Rolodex. And you can sit there and be like, "Hey, I hear what you're saying. I know a guy. Why don't we put you in touch with, Bob in this other department or this other agency or this other office?
Being resourceful.
Because he's been through exactly what you've been through, right? And sometimes the best thing you can do is refer.
Yeah. Well, and that goes both ways, right? Because you connect with people, mentors who are resourceful and can point you in the right direction, but also hopefully you have several mentors and you know which one to ask about which things.
And each mentor relationship is going to vary. Like it's going to change, just like Mike's saying, because each underling, each mentee, it's an awkward word, but that's what it's called. Each mentee is going to vary. And it helps to have a couple different professional areas to hit, right? It talk through short range, long range. Like, what are your problems this week? What are your problems 5 years out? What's your plan? What's your 5-year plan? What's your 10-year plan? What's your career plan? What's your life plan, right? You need to be able to talk about the tactical stuff day to day. How are you doing your job? Whatever, in whatever sense that is. If you are an electrician, you're talking about, how do you do the specific techniques in your job, right? And then there's like the professional career development stuff. And like I said, one of the things I've noticed is senior leaders really enjoy talking about that, partly because it's important and partly because it's what they were good at.
Yeah, it's something they mastered.
And they want to help others get where they got, and I appreciate and recognize that. But as it happens, that's not what I need. Or maybe I needed it a lot more 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But I don't need to hear about how to do my performance evals because it doesn't matter at this stage in my career how my performance evals go. What I need is something else, right? Figuring out what I'm going to do next in my next career, that kind of thing. And maybe you need to talk about balancing life with work. So think about it. There's a lot of different things you need to hit in, and I'm going to use the term mentoring session, but I don't want to paint this picture that you're sitting in an office across a desk from each other and you're having a session, right? Yeah. It's not like sitting down with your psychologist and you're sitting on the couch having a session. It's not like that. Like it can be going and getting coffee. It can be, when the cops face each other in a parking lot so they can watch each other's backs and talk about things.
That's actually huge though, for sure. A lot of mentoring happens in exactly that way.
Oh yeah. It can be at the hotel bar when you're on a trip with your air crew, whatever. So when I say session, I don't want to make it too formal,
interaction,
it's in whatever sense, right? But think about when you're talking to your guys, how do we get through individual day-to-day stuff versus the long-range stuff? How do we get through advancing your career in the direction you want to go? How do we talk through balancing life and work? Listen to them, figure out what's stressing them out. And again, that goes generationally. Like the things that freak out the youngins where I work is not the same thing that freaks us old guys out, right?
So to kind of bring this full circle, when it comes to mentoring and informal leadership within an organization, you need to recognize this as the glue that holds, or I should say that builds the culture, right? And you want peer accountability. You want high expectations. You want an environment where people are willing to be open and honest when it's time to be open and honest. And how you get there is not something that you can necessarily force or order or dictate. It's something that you have to foster. And it's also something that has to happen at every level, right? Everyone needs to be, needs to recognize, if you get onto the SWAT team, just as an example, right? Personal example, you get onto the SWAT team and you're a new guy. See that as an opportunity to also lead, right? You're new, you're just getting started, but everyone's a leader here. And next year there's going to be a new SWAT class and you're going to be the senior class to them. And so you need to start to kind of embrace your role in that and hope that everyone in the organization does, because that mentoring is going to happen at every step. And a lot of that peer level accountability and mentoring is a big deal. And remember that trust and credibility is the foundation of all of it. you're building relationships with people, and you're hoping that they're going to listen to what you have to say, that they're going to follow your advice, not because you're their boss and you ordered them to do it, but because you're a guy worth listening to and your input makes sense.
Let me give you a little quick mentoring example. Say I'm at the range and I'm a young cop and I see SWAT officer Mike at the range, and he's got that cool tricked out gun, and he's nailing all the little bullseyes. And I say, hey, how do I get a cool gun like yours? What does Mike tell me?
Say, who cares about the gun, man? Whatever you got in your hands is the one you got to get good with.
Right. And, there's mentoring just right there. Right. It doesn't have to be a whole session.
And that was an impromptu example, by the way, like that Jim just kind of threw at me. But this is a conversation that I've had with cops 1,000 times, right? They're like, oh man, what magwell or extended mag release or what kind of bells and whistles can I put on this Glock pistol? And I'm like, well, the first thing you could do is learn how to shoot it just how it is, right? Like there's no reason you can't figure out. Now there's some limitations to that, right? Like there are times where like your hand size and the gun size, might present some little things, but generally speaking, work with what you have, right? This is a people ideas hardware thing, is that like you can train yourself to do whatever, but I've had that conversation with 12 people or more over the course of my career, one-on-one, where they've come to me and asked for that sort of like, hey, I want to get better at shooting. What should I put on? Like, what should I modify? How should I modify my gun? And I'm like, it's all up here, man. Like you need to work on this first. And all the gear and the gadgets that we have on that SWAT truck are not nearly as important as the people behind them. So stop getting distracted by that sort of thing. That happens all the time with people. So it's a great example.
Yeah. So from my perspective, I mean it when I say it takes a village to raise an operator in any sense, or an officer, military officer, police officer, whatever. Mentoring isn't about one particular session or relationship, and it's sure as hell not about some military handbook. You need a mix of people to mold and polish the new guys into something useful when they come out of the police academy or the Air Force Academy or ROTC or basic training or whatever. Like, they ain't ready. We know that. They know that, right? And it takes the whole team to kind of bring them into the fold, make them feel accepted, make them feel like they're a part of it, make them feel a sense of ownership. And sometimes they need a good ass chewing. And sometimes they need to get picked up and dusted off and pep talked. And sometimes they need to learn the career ladder and how to climb up it. And sometimes they need to learn when to shut up and color, right? And that works. That whole system works if you get the whole cadre, the old guys, on board with doing this mentoring thing. And it starts with getting those guys to take a sense of ownership. Because those new guys aren't just a bunch of chodes and dingleberries. They're your chodes and dingleberries to fix. So do something about it, right?
Yeah. And remember, like, building from mentoring and mentorship into teamwork. Like, the synergy is in that group of individuals, right? That all bring their own qualities and traits to the table in a way that complements each other to build something better than just the sum of the parts. So you need that mix and match, right? You need that
diversity and inclusion, would you say?
Yeah, that's exactly what I said.
That's good. I know, right?
So I think that's all I got.
Be safe out there, be smart out there, and find somebody and teach them something, right? That's the whole point here.
And listen to the people trying to help you out.
That's right.
All right, guys, that's all we got for tonight. This episode is brought to you by Drip Drop. Drip Drop Oral Rehydration Solution is an electrolyte powder that you mix with water. It was formulated by a doctor for quick absorption. I work in the desert, and it only takes a few hours in the heat, wearing body armor, carrying around a bunch of gear before I start feeling like crap and fall behind the curve in dehydration. Drip Drop keeps you in the fight so you can finish the mission and rehab for the next one. go get you some at dripdrop.com or on Amazon, or ask your supply guy to find it for you. Don't forget that we put out new episodes on the 1st and the 15th of every month. If you like what we're doing, you can head over to Patreon, give us $1 for each new episode. That money's going to go back into bringing you good content. If you want to interact with us, you could find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We are at TacTangents. You can also email info@tacticaltangents.com. And one last thing, our Facebook discussion group. We've got a little group going on Facebook. If you go to the groups tab on our page, you can join it. We've got more followers on our page than we have in the group. So I know there's some of you out there following the Facebook page that are on Facebook that are not in the group. Lots of like-minded people in there. So come hang out with us. All right. That's all we got. Good talk.